Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I have a very special guest, Dr. Celene Ibrahim. You're most welcome on Blogging Theology.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. And I'll just tell you a little bit about her published work and her academic background. According to her own website, which I'll link to in the description below, Dr. Celene Ibrahim is the author of Women and Gender in the Qur'an from Oxford University Press, published just last year. Islam and Monotheism from Cambridge University Press, forthcoming next year, and dozens of academic articles. And in fact, if you go on her website, you can see a number of articles by her. You can read them there. She's also the editor of One Nation Indivisible, Seeking Liberty and Justice from the Pulpit to the Streets, published in 2019. Dr. Celene Ibrahim holds a doctorate in Arabic and Islamic civilizations and a master's degree in women's and gender studies and Near Eastern and Judaic studies from Brandeis University, a master's of divinity from Harvard University, and a bachelor's degree with the highest honors from Princeton University. She offers lectures, workshops, and seminars around the world as a trusted voice on issues of religion and civic engagement, spiritual care and chaplaincy, Islamic intellectual history, and women's studies. So, and there are many other academic honors that she has had bestowed on her, if you look at the website too. So coming back to the book, if we may, the most recent one, Women and Gender in the Qur'an, published by Oxford University Press, apparently is the first book of its kind to explore the entire cast of Quranic female figures, which I think is an extraordinary omission, really, not to have been done before. But what was your own motivation in authoring this text?
Well, I'll say two things on being the first of something. I'm the first to do it comprehensively. I think I welcome if people read the book and think that I should have included other figures that they're possibly there that I missed. But certainly there were other women who did partial surveys, and I say women because it has been a field that has been largely dominated by women academics, in fact. And so I'm not the first to attempt, obviously, to discuss the women figures in the Qur'an, but I think my methodology in terms of aspiring to be comprehensive is path setting in that regard. And I set out to write the book that I really wanted to read that wasn't on the market, which I think is actually great advice for young scholars to find that niche and what really sets them alive. And for me, that was reading the Qur'an and noticing that there were so many aspects that pertain to the women figures that I was not seeing being discussed, whether in the academic literature or in a more confessional Muslim space. And so while I set out to write an academic book, I also had an eye for how it could be influential in terms of a broader Muslim audience as well.
Yes, and what aspects of the Quranic portrayal of female figures has been overlooked, do you think, in previous writing and discourse on the Quran?
Yes, in terms of the academic scholarship on the Quran, and I'm thinking coming out of women and gender studies specifically, there was an abundance of focus on legal verses that involved women and gender in some regard, but there was less attention to the subtleties of how women figures were portrayed. And what I do in a later chapter in the book is actually link the depictions of women figures to certain precedents, certain legal precedents. And I attempt to make the argument that it's the stories in the Quran are actually showing in many instances how to empathetically, compassionately institute a law in a community. So I'm trying to make that link. While I don't explicitly touch on a lot of the legal content of the Quran that has to do with gender in the book, I try to make that link by saying that the Quran is teaching us through these stories of these women, and in particular in the later period where the rules do become more refined, where there's more of a movement away from the basics of theology and character development to really thinking about how to institute a just society.
Well, one of the things that I noticed was that there's only one woman in the Quran who's named by her first name, and that is Mary, obviously the mother of Jesus. I mean, how important is Mary in the Quran, and why is she the only person named? Do you think? And a whole chapter's surah is named after her, of course.
Yes, I get this question very frequently, and the answer that I came to is that Mary is discussed in the Quran as being especially unique. And the fact that she's mentioned by first name is actually one of the ways in which the Quran reiterates this aspect of Mary and being
Mm,
exceptionally unique among women. So obviously there's a theological component for Muslims in terms of her having conceived of the prophet Jesus, of Isa. But in terms of even her presentation in the Quran, she is unique. And I
mm,
think that there's, because she does not have, in a sense, a husband figure that's linked to her in the Islamic tradition, unlike in the Christian tradition,
mm,
where Joseph, as the husband of Mary, features. We really don't have that in the Quran, and I think that's another way of the sacred scripture drawing attention to her role as a woman who is, and this is the way I, in fact, start the book, a woman who is bearing the word of God, which is
mm.
an epithet for Jesus in the Quran.
Indeed. Just changing the emphasis slightly, you offer an analysis of sex and sexuality as depicted in the Quran. Am I right in thinking that sex as a biological gender, and sex as a well, not the action, but the actual gender, it is rooted in the Quran, in creation and biology. So it's not free floating a cultural product. It has a rootedness in the created order. Would that be fair?
Exactly. And this is where I get pushback from some feminist thinkers who otherwise appreciate the work. And my response to them is that I'm really going off the Quranic presentation of
Yeah.
gender, which does pretty much, in terms of my reading, and I, of course, welcome other readings, it very much does make an emphasis on the untha and the dhakar, which is the female and the male
Mm,
in Arabic. And there's no mention necessarily of a third sex, or although when we come to Islamic law, we do find discussion of, the human condition, in fact, is not as binary as untha and dhakar, male and female. Uh,
mm,
but we don't necessarily find, and then we have, I should say, we find plenty of terms that are gendered in more of a social sense. So we have, terms for woman and wife and,
mm,
husband, and plenty of different terms. In fact, the same term is not repeatedly used, although nisa for women is the most common
mm.
word in Arabic used.
So,
And
so
I try to, just one more interesting
please,
thing on
please.
that, actually. The word in Arabic, zawj, which I know I've been listening to your podcast, so I know that you've discussed this before on the podcast. But the word zawj in Arabic can refer, it's the general word for spouse. And we find that in many of the more ontological verses about human beings, spouse is the word in Arabic that's used, zawj, which is gender encompassing, we could say.
Mm, mm,
And when we find that we get to the more detailed laws about how to govern a society, then I find that the language switches and is more specific: wife, husband, etc.
mm, mm. No, that's helpful. How does that feed into the discourse of Islamic feminism, if I can use that term? I noticed in your introduction you caveated your own self-description as contributing to feminism. I think you took a female-centric discourse rather than feminist discourse because of the great variety of feminisms that one
And
can
also, to be
come.
even more specific about it, the ways in which feminism has been used in ways that are incredibly harmful and hurtful to Muslims. And so
Mm,
that word in Muslim contexts, especially given, even as early, I mean, as late as interventions in Afghanistan, we see that idea of feminism was leveraged in a way that is very problematic. And so that's part of the reason that I stay away from it. If we're thinking about the context, the issues that I'm engaged with, I'm very much reading and responding to a lot of the feminist literature that's coming out of the academy. So it's, it's certainly, I'm trying to really hold that space and be that bridge between the more traditional approaches to Islamic knowledge and the academic approaches coming out of women and gender studies, for instance.
You briefly touched on, I know this is slightly digressing, but the way that feminism as a ruling ideology amongst the political and media elites in the West has now become part of imperial or military outreach, such that NATO, the West, Britain, the USA can speak in terms of freeing Muslims from the Muslim oppression in Afghanistan as part of their military objectives and rationale for being there. And of course that's deeply concerning, but it's interesting it has that central role now in the West's ideological outreach to make sure that the whole world conforms to Western values. Now that's a very controversial, that's just my observation, but
absolutely. And a lot has been written on this subject, so I would defer to the people who are most knowledgeable on this. But I will say that in terms of being a Muslim from the West, and I as many people who know my work know that I came into Islam as well. So I feel a certain extra responsibility not to perform a type of white American feminism when I approach the Qur'an, given this background and my own baggage.
I didn't realize you were a revert. Sorry, you're a revert as well. No, that's lovely. Okay. Can I just to offer? Okay, I'm going to propose a thesis and invite you to object to it or critique it or nuance it. That one of the central planks of feminist criticism of the social systems we've seen in the West is patriarchy. Patriarchy is a great evil. It needs to be dismantled. It needs to be replaced by an egalitarian social order where gender is no longer a factor in social roles and so on. But my slightly provocative proposal would be, is there not a case, but on the Quran and in your studies, to talk about a healthy patriarchy? I know this may sound like an oxymoron, complete contradiction, but I would, in defense of this provocative thesis, refer to the famous 4th surah, verse 34, just the first part of it. I'm just reading from the study Quran, which you yourself allude to in your book, which goes in English: men are the upholders and maintainers of women by virtue of that in which God has favored some of them above others, and by virtue of their spending from their wealth. Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in their husband's absence what God has guarded. And the note to this particular verse in the study Quran says, this verse is the clearest statement of a man's role and authority in the marital relationship as head of the household in relation to his responsibility to provide for his wife. Other verses suggest mutuality in the relationship between husband and wife, but this verse indicates a hierarchy from a certain perspective between the two, at least on the social plane. And I won't read the rest of it. So it seems you're making a distinction between the familial context within the family, but on the spiritual level, what before our Creator, there is an equality of access to God's grace, God's mercy, to salvation, and so on. What would be, given what I'm being slightly provocative here, would that be a credible case for a sort of healthy patriarchy in that limited context, or is that have a response to that?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's one in which many Muslims who do have a firm grounding in the Quran, they're coming at the issues in this particular way. And I think that if we're going to stress the ways in which men have caretaking responsibilities towards women, women also have caretaking responsibilities towards the men in their lives, towards their property, towards the children, and that this is likewise, for the males to females in their lives. And so I think, there's paradigms that look at it in terms of gender complementarity, and I don't do that because I don't think the Quran gives us essential feminine essence and an essential masculine essence that complement each other, in domestic spheres or something like this. I mean, I see it a bit differently. I see it more that any given human being has a lot of relationships of accountability in their lives, and they also have people who are designated to be their caretakers and their providers. And it happens that within the Islamic framework, there's a particular care given to a woman, a girl, at every point in her journey. And if we think about ways in which women are particularly vulnerable in society, this to me makes absolute sense. And if we look at sexual assaults, if we look at what happens when societies are politically destabilized, women bear a tremendous physical cost for this. And so I think in a greater scheme, it makes sense to have certain extra guards to ensure the safety of women and girls. And I think too that if we're not thinking about gender in terms of always being a competition between, an absolute zero-sum game between male rights and female rights, we can see that what the Qur'an is doing is actually very nuanced, and it's giving a certain shade of rights to girl children vis-a-vis their fathers and their mothers, and it's giving certain rights to wives vis-a-vis their husbands. So there's a very, it's not a it's not a simple black and white type of approach to thinking about gender in society.
No, absolutely right. There is great nuance and complexity and diversity within the Quran's presentation of women, particularly queens of Sheba, so the heads of state, to humble townsfolk and so on. There's incredible diversity. So
we miss too. Sorry, I just want to get in on this point because it's so important to, I think, the lived experience of being Muslim. What we find is that, if we're thinking about patriarchy as male rule, what we find is women have been in certain times and places excluded from the political space. And I don't see that as a model for what an Islamic society looks like based on a Quranic model at all, really. And I think Islam, the Islamic law as it's been developed, it looks very different in different times and places, obviously. But I think there's a enormous role that women play in the public sphere. There's and I think if we're thinking both about the intimate space of the family and the ways in which I want to say that there's a sophisticated relationship between the rights and the responsibilities of both spouses, I think we also need to stress, and I'm speaking here thinking, Muslim thinkers articulating what is the public sphere, this idealized public sphere with regard to gender. I think we need to continue to articulate the important role that all people play in this public sphere, and not fall into what is sometimes really a rather Western, historically Western binary of thinking of the private sphere as the woman's sphere.
I think one of the interconnections between the public and the private is the marriage contract that men and women obviously enter into, and is often usually not understood at all in the West. That the women have rights to stipulate in the marriage contract about the future state of their marriage. So whether or not the husband can engage, be polygamous in the future, what to do, the circumstances of any divorce, and so on. This can all be stipulated ahead of time in the marriage contract by the woman to protect her interests and also her wishes for what the marriage will be like in the future. Could you say a bit more about that and why that's often overlooked, isn't it, in Western discourse about women in Afghanistan and so on. And
It's
these are
not, yes, to be completely frank, it's not only overlooked in Western discourses. Many times in Muslim societies, women might not actually have the knowledge about what their rights are going into a marriage. So again, that's an issue of education. How well are women being exposed to Islamic law to be able to know their rights, as well as their responsibilities. And there's a number of grassroots organizations that, in fact, work on that very issue to ensure that from the beginning, women have a clear understanding as they embark on marriage. But certainly, I think that's a key aspect of a Muslim marriage. And even in the Western context, where most Muslims that I would work with as a chaplain, for instance, are also registering their marriages with whatever US state that they reside in, for instance, they're still wanting to obviously go through the steps of an Islamic marriage. And in particular, I encourage the people who I'm helping to facilitate their marriage to think very carefully about all of these different stipulations that they could add into the contract as a way of articulating their own personal desires and needs and their familial circumstances going into the marriage to help make it successful and sustainable.
Can we detail, just for all our sakes, the viewers, what those rights are? So what can a future wife stipulate as part of this contract that must be honored by her husband? And presumably, if it's not, she could go to court and hold him to account to uphold her rights. So what kind of issues are we talking about that she can specify?
Yeah, actually, the way the jurists think about it is what kind of issues can she not specify, because the sphere is so broad. And so essentially, the agreement could state many things as long as it doesn't violate the basic architecture of the Muslim marriage. So for instance, she could not specify that this will be a sexually open relationship in which I may have other partners, for instance. That would inherently violate an essential principle of an Islamic marriage with regard to the woman's role. So there's, it's easier to talk about that. What you might see most common are aspects involving education or where a woman would like to reside, and sometimes that has to do with her desire to be close to family and not have to uproot. One of the most important, as you well know, reading up, but your audience may not, one of the most important negotiation pieces around a marriage contract is what the meher, the gift from the future husband to the future wife will be. And for some people, that is an incredibly important aspect of financial stability and security. And some women will specify a monetary amount. Other women might be in other ways financially secure and feel that that's not a priority for them in this particular contract and might stipulate something else that doesn't have a large monetary sum. But this is it's an important aspect of a time in which a woman can very much articulate her needs, her wider family needs going into a marriage.
Well, it's very good to hear that, and it was extremely important. This issue of the it was the case in the West, certainly in the UK. I'm not sure about the United States. Until relatively recently, a woman's property, her income, her savings, were actually owned and controlled by her husband, and she, the husband basically had a right to do with those. And they weren't really hers at the end of the day. She might have functional use of them, but ultimately they were controlled and owned by the husband. But that's not the case, is it, in Islamic marriage? And could you just explain why it's so different? And this has always been the case, right up from the beginning of Islam, if you like, in Arabia. It's not a modern progressive innovation. This is part of
it's
Islam.
Remarkable when we look up and see what else is happening in the 7th century Common Era around the world, that women are given property rights, not only as wives, but as daughters, if they're inheriting from their fathers, as mothers if they're inheriting from their children. So there's this independent ability for women to hold wealth has, when Islamic societies are functioning well, you often find that a large amount of the wealth is held in the hands of women. And you also find that the women tend to spend a great deal of that wealth in ways that promote the social good, through owning orchards, through setting up educational foundations, through supporting Islamic scholarship. So that's I think the ideal situation is, in fact, financially empowering women, not just within the family, but across the society.
And that's remarkable. And this is by law, by right, in Islamic, in the Sharia. This is, I say, not some kind of recent progressive innovation. I was just, when you were talking about that, and inevitably a famous historical character came to mind, the first wife of the Prophet himself, Khadija. Now, he was married monogamously to her for, I don't know, 20 years.
25 or so, yes.
I mean, a quarter of a century before any other marriages, which may become more notorious in the West anyway, have been mentioned. And who was she? I mean, she was a businesswoman, a woman of independence. She was older than him. She had social and economic clout by definition.
And she proposed to him too, which, when I work with younger women who are navigating the marriage scene, she's an incredibly important and influential figure, historically throughout the development of Islam, as women have articulated their roles. And this is, it's phenomenal to have this woman with, this business experience and this, I think too that if the Prophet, peace be upon him, is taken in Muslim context to be a model, well, we should find far more Muslim men marrying, for instance, women who are 15 years their senior, or the like. And we certainly don't find that. So I would say, if I had to objectively analyze it, that's an area in which the Muslim community is failing on a wide scale to uphold the Prophet's example.
But to really emphasize this point, so the Prophet himself, the first woman he married, and when he actually became a prophet, when the angel Gabriel came to him, he ran to her for support, counsel, affirmation, which she gave, of course. So she was a really important figure right at the beginning of his prophetic ministry. But she was older than him. She was a businesswoman. She traded. What was her occupation? She traded with the Levant and Syria. In I forget what exactly what her business was.
Yes, she was in the trading business and running caravans between Arabia and other places, not just Syria, but Syria was an important trade route.
Right. So she would have had employees, or what we would call employees.
And the Prophet Muhammad was one of her employees, in fact.
Right. Now that's an interesting point. The Prophet Muhammad was one of Khadija's employees. Okay. I'm glad you said that.
The other thing I should mention too, with regard to her, is it's not just her social status that ensured that the Prophet had a number of kind of protectors as the Muslim community was spreading, but it was also her wealth as well. She spent her entire fortune when the time in which the Muslim community, the early Muslims, were being boycotted from the rest of the tribes of Mecca. And so it's not only her personal support of the Prophet Muhammad, but her financial support of the community that in many ways allowed it to exist in its most fragile state.
It's interesting. And just for the record, when the Prophet married Khadija, when he was a prophet, he didn't insist that she stop work and become a housewife.
You've said it as I would say it to my fellow Muslims.
Okay. No, I mean, so it's not the case. I just wanted to establish. I'm not putting down housewives, but I'm saying that in this particular case, she continued. Well, as you said, she supported the embryonic community with her wealth. And while you were saying that, I couldn't help but think of in the Gospels, Jesus was reputedly supported by wealthy women in his ministry. Actually, this is mentioned. So I just kind of thought, there's a prophetic paradigm here.
Yes, I should also stress that from what we understand from the early sources, and they're not a whole lot of sources that we can really get at to understand more clearly Khadija's role herself. But from what we can understand, it wouldn't be her who was setting out on these caravan journeys
No.
necessarily. She was managing and making the executive business decisions.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to also stress that there's a concern historically in the legal literature that when women do work, and it's recognized that women will have work, I mean, that's not even really a question in the legal literature, it's just assumed, but that they should have work that's dignified and that ensures their safety and things of this nature. So there's an ideal around women working that also goes in line with a greater Islamic ethos of protecting human dignity.
Yeah, that's a very important point. There's another wife of Muhammad who attracts notoriety in the West for reasons I don't really want to go into here, unless you particularly want to discuss it. I refer to Aisha, but I wanted just to focus, if you're okay with this, on an important aspect of her role as an adult, as a transmitter of knowledge about the Prophet, particularly after he passed away, and as a scholar, as someone who has had a vital role in the Isnad, the transmission of Hadith to us today through Bukhari and Muslim and so on. But she was a significant repository of knowledge and authority, and as a teacher in her own right. Is that the case?
Absolutely, and also as a legal theorist and a transmitter, of course, as you mentioned. So she
Right.
was not merely transmitting; she was also involved in actively articulating this emerging field of Islamic law as it was being practically applied to new situations.
Mm-hmm. So that is extraordinary. So is her role and status as not just as a transmitter, but doing ijtihad or giving her opinions, is that recognized in the Muslim world more generally? I wouldn't know. Is that something that is still preserved, that memory of her role?
Oh, absolutely. Anybody who studies the early history will see that quite clearly. And she's not alone by any means. There are quite a few women of that early generation who were also legal scholars and who were transmitters of, certainly not to the extent in terms of hadith transmission that Aisha was. It does get a little bit complicated if we look at different perspectives on Aisha, because she is involved in a revolt in her later years, and the revolt was not successful, and it was essentially during a civil war in the early Muslim community. The Prophet Muhammad would speak regularly when he was alive about not dividing, and the early Muslims managed to not divide for for a few years, but it didn't hold. And so she in certain communities of Muslims, she's not quite as celebrated. In fact, has a very problematic political role, even though she's still recognized as a wife of the.
True. Yeah, no, that's true. I just want to very briefly, if I may just touch on the other wives of Muhammad. And one of the stereotypes in the West is of a rapacious, lusty prophet who had lots and lots of wives, and this bespeaks of some kind of immorality and ungodliness compared to the allegedly celibate Jesus. Of course, I'm not quite sure why celibacy is somehow better than having wives, but of course the reality is quite different, isn't it? I mean, the most of the wives, if not all of them, apart from Aisha, I think, had been married before. I could be wrong. And that the reasons for the marriages to these women were different than his own personal desires, shall we say? Could you explain why these women were invited to become part of the prophetic
Yes, I
house?
think we should start at thinking about what is the purpose of a marriage. And so we have a particular narrative in the West that it is about sexual gratification, and we might add other things onto that, partnership or the like. But if we're thinking about the social context of a marriage in Arabia, and we might expand that to a Muslim context, it's a way in which for instance, with the Prophet Muhammad's case, and of course we see this in Western societies as well, that alliances are made between different tribes. And so a number of the women that the Prophet Muhammad proposed to in his lifetime were major figures in other tribes, which essentially makes the tribes in-laws to one another and promotes peace and harmony. So he, in large part, was able to establish a unity among, a tenuous unity, but a tenuous unity that nonetheless lasted among the Arab tribes, partly through these marital agreements. And also we find that he took on the widows of a number of his close friends and companions. And that was a thing of honor to do at that time in Arabia. And contrary to what we might see in Muslim societies today, the widows were actually encouraged, in the Qur'an and through the example of the Prophet Muhammad, to remarry. So whereas sometimes there's a popular stigma in Muslim societies around a widow getting remarried, that is definitely not an Islamic principle.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So
there's a waiting period. I should say there's a waiting period that a widow
yes.
goes through, but it's fairly short, relatively speaking. And
So from what I understand, then the reason for these other marriages, what was political? Muhammad, of course, was a head of state. He wasn't just a private man. So he forming alliances with other tribes for the greater good and so on. And this is why he's an exception to the Quranic limitation of marriage to 4 wives at most. And even then, there are quite strong caveats about the circumstances in which one can do that. So, and you say he had a protective role, so marrying widows, so ensuring their welfare rather than just leaving them abandoned, really. And so that there were those kinds of reasons. But I think Khadija then would be his first love. Presumably, he did marry her for more traditional reasons because that perhaps they loved each other. It wasn't because she was a widow or something.
Yeah, if we read the literature, he's the Blessed Prophet. Well, he's not a prophet necessarily at that stage, but he's quite shocked that she does have an interest in him, and it's again, as we've said before, I think that having this relationship as the primary one in the Prophet's life for so long, I think it really should and does hearten women in their own kind of journey. And it's very difficult, especially for educated women, for instance, to find, and I'm talking about the contemporary sphere here, to find spouses that still feel like they are in their, of marriageable age when they hit 35. And the Prophet Muhammad also, we have these very sweet moments as he was speaking with a woman that comes from his own tribe, and she basically said, I'm very old at this point, and I already have children, and anyway, I'm a jealous woman. And he responds to her and says, as for your age, I'm a little bit older than you are. As for your children, they're my children. And as for your jealousy, I'll pray that God removes it from you.
Oh, that's really sweet. Oh, that's lovely. Just finally, again, another controversial issue in a way. I watched a video, Star Wars and the Crisis of Modern Masculinity. It's a khutbah by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, Tim Winter from Cambridge University, and particularly talking about the crisis of modern masculinity, the men in the West not having sacred rites of initiation into adulthood and what their responsibilities as men are, and so on. But also the frequent complaint from women, and not just Muslim women, in the absence of suitable male companions, for suitable husbands, I should say, going forward. Is this a problem in the Muslim community as well, that men are finding, so the women are finding that there are not as many eligible men around that they would like to marry, shall we say?
Yes, and I have a number of friends and people in my circles who are, very well educated, are financially independent, are incredibly dedicated to their faith, have a beautiful character, and because they are more financially independent, or because they are older, or because they are seen as threatening because they're more educated. But we find this is not just a phenomenon for Muslim societies. We find that if we look at sociological data more broadly as well. So there's, yeah, I mean, it's an issue, and I think part of the way that the issue is not to tell women don't become educated or be financially independent, right? It really is a crisis of masculinity in that way.
Yeah, and I know this is not the brief, certainly, of this discussion, but what would be would you have any pointers towards a solution to this almost global crisis of masculinity now, where, as I say, we don't have men don't have role models. Often they're absent fathers. Women bring up children on their own through no fault of their own. But and this can lead to greater incidents of suicide, which overwhelmingly tends to affect young men. Delinquency and criminality. It has a knock-on effect all over the place, and so it's not just a question of gender roles. It has social consequences. What can Islamic teaching contribute to the restoration of some wholesome, positive models going forward?
That is a fantastic question. I actually started working on a companion book to this. It's called, as you might expect, Men and Gender in the Qur'an. And I think that is, in fact, the driving question that I'm looking at with regard to Quranic guidance. And I think the religion of Islam places a lot of responsibility on the individual person to always be striving to perfect their character, to see themselves as in every moment, beholden to a God that sees them, even if they cannot, see God. And I think that those two basic principles, that the pursuit of character is in fact the essence of being human, in this Islamic worldview, and in worshiping God. And one of the ways you worship is to be obedient to the rules. And so, if we can just get character and rule following in place, those are two essential things. But your question is really sociological, and that's a harder one for me. It feels like human beings have always struggled with their relationships and their obligations to one another. I don't know that we collectively as a species have figured this out.
No, it's a work in progress. I didn't realize you were writing a book on that, so that's something to look forward to. Thank you for that. Talking of books that you're writing, you mentioned on your website that you are in the process of writing, or maybe you have already written, Islam and Monotheism, to be published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Sort of obvious question. I mean, lots of books have been written about Tawheed. I mean, what is your particular contribution to this discussion?
Yeah, so I expect that this, God willing, as we say, should be out early next year. And it's a very short book, and it's meant to provide the absolute essentials of what this perspective is. And I explain, hopefully in very clear terms, how an understanding of Islamic monotheism directly impacts a person's level of corruption, whether we're thinking of forms of political corruption, or we're thinking of forms of corruption of what we would talk about as the metaphorical heart of judgment. And so I'm trying to really clearly make this link between what upright understanding of the nature of the cosmos and human purpose is, to the sense of when a person is able to have an upright understanding, how that impacts their actual state of being, from intellectual to emotional, to what they're doing to their actions. So we'll see. It's meant to be a shorter read for folks, and just a desk resource for those who either are learning about Islam or who are kind of polishing up their Islamic knowledge.
I see. So I was going to ask who your target audience is, because your book on the gender in the Quran is certainly an academic book, not a popular book, shall we say. Is this more for the general public then?
I I hope that there will be a more general public readership. I'm still, as an academic, I think, learning how to write for a general readership on themes of theology. I welcome a blog like this. I think it's a wonderful way to be public facing. But I definitely. I hope to find ways as I go through my writing career to make religion and theology as widely interesting as possible. I don't know, Paul, do you have secrets on that one?
No, I just follow my nose, what I find interesting, but I enjoy talking about theology, shall we say. So as part of the communication, I enjoy helping people to understand it in a more accessible way what, the people behind you and me, the scholars, are saying, because it's such an important subject. It used to be called, interestingly, the Queen of the Sciences. A female monarch was the titular head of this. It was the greatest of all subjects because it encompasses everything that is most important about life: God, salvation, our destiny, the afterlife. Whereas everything else seems to be much more local compared to that. So yeah. Well, but perhaps this is a natural place to conclude. But is there anything else you wanted to say, Dr. Celene, about your work and what you want to share with the readers?
Thank you so much for hosting me. And I think just to say that, maybe to encourage people to, if they have certain proclivities or certain opinions about women in Islam, going into to maybe really try hard to find that different perspective that can be a bridge for empathy and compassion and kind of relationships in the human world. I think we really have to pull, and I know you're in the UK, I'm in the US, but we're I think as scholars we play this very important role in helping people be less bigoted and more open-minded. And so I would just, as a final plea for what is the role of the scholar, I hope that people could engage my work on that, on that ground.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. Yes, a scholarship can bring a depth and a nuance, even at times an ambiguity, which can be missing in the more binary simplicities of ideology. So that may be one of the most important things that academia, at its best, when it's not being obscure and when it's open to the world, can bring to the betterment of our world. So, well, thank you so much indeed, Dr. Celene Ibrahim. Very, very interesting indeed. I'm sure the viewers will find it fascinating. Do leave your comments below. I will link, as I say, to your website and to your most recent book, and I'll keep my eye out for your forthcoming book on monotheism, published maybe next year by Cambridge. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you. All the best.